Morning, everybody. Can I just say that we've received apologies from the chair and the deputy chair today, and therefore, please can we have nominations for someone to chair the meeting?
Can I nominate Kat Scott?
Kat Scott? Is that seconded and agreed? Yes, yes. Okay, so Kat Scott. Yeah.
Okay, good morning and welcome to the Education and Children's Social Care Overview Scrutiny Committee, Wednesday the 16th of February here in the Charles Dickens Hall at the BMI suite. First item on the agenda is notice of recording a webcast, and this meeting is going out live and will be webcast or subsequently broadcast via the Council's YouTube website, and that members of the press and public may record and take photographs except where there are exempt items. I will put my teeth back in my mouth. Okay. Item 2, apologies. We have apologies from Councillors Cooner, Councillor Jenkins, Councillor Armstrong, Councillor Hodibala, Councillor Iro, Omar Hanif and Sarah Smith. Are there any other apologies? Okay. 3, any declarations of interest? Councillor Yip.
Thank you, Chair. I think most people know I'm the Deputy Chair of this for Worcestershire School. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. On to item 4, to confirm the action notes of the formal meeting held on the 24th of November and of the informal meeting held on the 12th of January. Any comments? Okay. On to item 5, which is the SEND dashboard, and I would like to welcome Sue Harrison, Director for Education's Director of Children's Services, to present this item. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. So I've also got my Trustee Assistant Director, Pauline, who's joining us online. This is a bit like sales, isn't it? Where you say, are you there, Pauline? Are you there? I think she is.
I am there, yes, Sue.
Good morning, Pauline.
Morning.
Excellent. So rightly, you wanted to be cited on the SEND performance, and SEND data is a crucial bit, isn't it, Pauline, of the work that we're putting into place to make sure that we can have robust monitoring. Like many places across the country, we have had very little data in the world of SEND, which is extraordinary, seeing as we have so much performance data in the world of social care and in the world of education. But for a long, long time, there were only 2 statutory reporting KPIs for SEND, and that clearly wasn't enough, because we managed to then have a decline in service without that being flagged up in the data. So there is a big job to make sure that we've got quality assured data and accurate data, and then as part of objective 1, we've got a whole stream of work to make sure that we're working as a system and not just looking at one section of the data, but looking across the system. However, I'd like to say a bit more about how we're trying to get our own house in order before we talk about the system, because we do have some work to do within CENAR to feed into that dashboard. The dashboard is an improvement area on the Accelerated Progress Plan, monitored, as you know, by the SEND Improvement Board, but I think it's really helpful that open scrutiny are also cited on the dashboard. So I'll hand over now to Pauline, if that's okay with you, Pauline, to take us through more of the detail about the dashboard and about in particular, the countable data side of things. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. So just as an overview, and then I'm also going to hand over to Victor Roman, who leads on the dashboard. As you know, Overview and Scrutiny agreed that we would have a deep dive into the 4 objectives of the Accelerated Progress Plan, and the following aligning to the work of the SEND Improvement Board. And the SEND Improvement Board are concerned rightly about monitoring the data which can point to improvement. And so we agreed at the last meeting that this one would be looking at that dashboard, and that this dashboard will be regularly updated for you. There will be other data that obviously will be given to you, but this dashboard is the one that obviously DFE and Ofsted will be monitoring. So it's important that this committee actually has not only access to this, but the opportunity to discuss this. So this is why this one is here. Of the 4 objectives, as you know, that I would say the most important one, because if we don't get CENAR right, we can get the rest right, but we're still going to have major problems. The CENAR indicators are actually nationally quite small in terms of numbers. And in actual fact, the main one that all authorities are judged on is the percentage of plans that you managed, assessments that you managed to go through in 20 weeks. In actual fact, we are still above the national average, and even DFE are surprised about that, considering the enormous churn and difficulties we've had in CENAR. But of course, if you just used that as the key indicator, which is the key indicator for SEND, that would say that all our SEND services are above the national average, and that clearly isn't the case. And that's what Ofsted have found, and you as ONS know. So it's important that you have the full range of the dashboard that is aligned to those objectives. Just quickly on CENAR, and then I'm going to pass over to Victor. You've always asked for ONS, the senior responsible officer, the SRO for the objective, and the project manager, main project managers, some of them have more, for the objective. Obviously for the dashboard, we don't have that because we're all doing it. I mean, it's absolutely fundamental. And our overall SEND programme manager, Victor Roman, is overseeing this, and hence he's here this morning. But just to follow Sue's lead, just to give you a little update on CENAR, because the next ONS is actually the deep dive into getting the basics right. And we're going to split that because we found from the SEND Improvement Board that there was so much discussion on the CENAR part of that the health bit and waiting lists we couldn't get to. And I know that overview and scrutiny since I've been here have been very concerned about waiting lists in our health colleagues and wanting to talk with our health colleagues about that. So what we will do with your agreement is split that objective into 2, just like the SEND Improvement Board have. So the next meeting would be the CENAR bit, where I'm the SRO, and the following meeting will be the health bit, and you can, and obviously health colleagues will attend. Okay. Just an update, and I'll pass over to Victor, or if you have any questions before I pass over to Victor. We are now, when we've recruited to more posts in terms of SEND, more very experienced officers. Another one started yesterday, and we are reviewing all of our paperwork, and we aim. We have started to send out information every 2 weeks to schools, parents, etc. in terms of that update. We will aim, this is our aim, and we think we can do it, that by September we will be fully operational on the code of practice. We will be certainly fully staffed. We will have gone through a permanent structure for SEND, and hopefully we will have approval in terms of the resources for SEND, because at the moment they're temporary through to March 23. But it is still a huge amount of work, and a lot of people are not seeing the progress obviously on the ground, but we can see in terms of the systems that there are progress. And some people are seeing the progress, but most people aren't yet. I'm just going to finally say, because I know you ask this rightly every meeting, absolutely rightly. Where are we on sense efficiency? Because even if CENAR was working at 100% superb in every way, according to the legislation, we still don't have school places for children. They're there, they are in places, but they're not in the right places. And that is going to take some time, obviously, to resolve. But we will have we've said for April, we're still on target to hit for April, a draft. It's only draft. We need to talk it through with everybody, but a sense efficiency strategy. And that always has to be linked with the progress of CENAR. CENAR don't do the sufficiency strategy, but it's you know, they need to know there are school places at the end of all of their work. So we will always link that to this item. I think as an introduction, I think that, unless there are any questions, I think it's appropriate I pass over to Victor Roman now.
Before we do that, Pauline, I just want to say that we'll discuss splitting the work programme between CENAR and Health in the work programme section, and we'll discuss that amongst ourselves to see whether it's appropriate for the committee. Yeah. And in the presentation, there are a number of acronyms. So if Roman or yourself could just explain to members of the public what those acronyms mean, and where you've used percentages, can you just explain the numbers behind those, please, so that we get a really good, clear understanding of the numbers as opposed to a percentage rate. And finally, there is a couple of charts where it's not clear what the measures are. So if we go to data analysis of waiting list times for XLT, on the left-hand axis, there's 80. Can you just explain what they are when you come to those? And then over to you, Roman. Victor.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you, Chair. I have to apologise profusely from the beginning. I'm currently down with COVID and I have an absolutely horrendous cough. So if intermittently I would have to mute, it would be for your benefit and the people listening, because I don't want to cause any eardrum injuries. If I were to go very quickly through the introductory slides, because I think what would be a benefit is for us to actually look at the data and for me to explain some of the content as the chair just requested. So if we go to page 30 of the pack, I think. We need to acknowledge that Send Data in Birmingham sits across the partnership, and they're currently. Yes, Jerry, please, if you wouldn't mind sharing the slides, that would be a lot easier. Thank you.
Okay, coming up. If you could continue, Victor, while the slides wing their way through the airwaves.
Thank you, Chair, of course. So as I was saying, Send Data in Birmingham does not sit just with the City Council. This is across the partnership, sits with the City Council, with the NHS Trusts, with the CCG, with Birmingham Children's Trust. And currently, we don't have a data management strategy to ensure that this is robustly managed and scrutinized, this results in low confidence of the data that we hold and how this is transferred into insights. You will see further down in a further slide what is the importance of data and why do we normally collect data, because collating data just for data sake is not appropriate. Also, it is important to acknowledge that data is as good as the systems where the data is imputed in. Apologies, that was a cough. And there is a lot of work that needs to be done on data management to ensure higher confidence in the data, because if the data is not inputted correctly, it can't be properly interrogated in order for us to get those insights. And as part of the accelerated progress plan, a part of objective 1, which is system leadership, we will look at management of our data and policies around this. Data is a tool. However, as a program, we must look at individual experience and outcomes so that we can adequately measure the benefits realization of progress. Next slide, please. Thank you. So in terms of progress to date, it is important to acknowledge that we are developing a data dashboard for the SEND improvement program, where we're trying to, as part of the design of the project, is to automate data feeds as much as possible in order to get a complete picture and to share with the program leads for updates and what the data actually shows us. Also, we are keen to have a well-defined user-focused purpose. So like I said before, it's not data just for data's sake, it's what is the benefit that data brings, what is the insight that data brings. So we have started engaging with data owners to understand data availability. We've started developing time frames of collection of the data from different sources. We're engaging with objective leads and KPIs on performance narratives. In terms of implementation of the plan, we will have at some point the dashboard fully developed with all the current data available. The dashboard will be regularly updated in order to show the progress on each key performance indicator. That's what KPI stands for. Gather feedback from the groups. And of course, as part of the review cycle, we will review the final dashboard to be carried out by the program, make changes as needed, and provide dashboard reports on a monthly basis. Sorry, as the project team and stakeholders outline the performance of the key performance indicators. Next slide, please.
When you finish this slide, I have a question for you, okay?
Yes, please, Chair, I'm listening.
Tom, okay, can we move over to Councillor Lee for his question?
Thank you, Chair. Can I firstly, Roman, I want to thank you for all your work, and I know that we sit together on the board.
Sorry, Councillor, it's
Victor. Apologies, Victor. And in terms of your cough, I hope you feel better. I also want to welcome the Cabinet member, Sharon Thompson, and I hope that she is well. And thank you for joining the meeting. It's just on this slide, Victor, in terms of where we are with the agenda pack, we've got the four sections. As you know, I'm quite keen to try and get some timelines put in place. I was wondering if you could go into this a bit more detail on where we are with project design and plan the projects. And if you have a timeline in mind for the implementation plan. At the improvement board, we've been talking in terms of improvement journey of 3 to 5 years. I'm quite keen to see if we can speed that up, but also try and get some timelines put in place that we can hold individuals to account for, please.
Thank you, Councillor. That is a very good question. In terms of timelines and timescales, it would be difficult for me to sit here today and give you a definitive timescale. The reason being is because that is dependent and codependent on a breadth of issues, such as, for instance, the update of the case management system that the Education Department uses in Birmingham City Council. So upgrading Impulse from Impulse Classic to Impulse Nexus. There's also work that needs to be done across the CCG and the trust in terms of that data. So at the moment, I wouldn't be able to formalize the timescales for yourselves because, as I said, is dependent on other bits of the program.
Okay, just a supplementary question.
Yes, please.
From me, when you speak about the Impulse system and the transfer of data over to Nexus, and I assume you're collating that data, hasn't that been going on for about 6 months? And was there not a team put in place to ensure that that was done swiftly?
Thank you, Councillor. I think there have been some technical difficulties with Impulse as a case management system, and we're currently working with the provider, with CACI, to resolve these as quickly as possible. So I think we've encountered particular difficulties, which, to be perfectly honest, is not unusual when implementing a new IT system, which perhaps were not factored in 6 months ago at the planning stage.
Okay, that's fair enough. But what would be really interesting would be if you could give us an update on the position for the next meeting.
Thank you, Chair. And I think it would be extremely appropriate to do that in the next meeting, as the next meeting will look at getting the basics right, and the implementation of the Nexus system sits within that particular objective. So it would be probably more appropriate to discuss it at that point.
Thank you, Victor.
Thank you. I suppose following from what the chair says, as you know, the timelines do tend to slip, as she's alluded to, a 6 month and then in terms of unforeseen situations. I appreciate the point around how we can't fix any long-term plans, deadlines, because of a reliance on other things to be done first. But is there any way we can try and focus down on some of the data, for example, with the very first steps, so we've got an idea of what sort of timelines we may be working to?
Thank you, Councillor. We can definitely look into that.
Thank you.
Chair, I'm not sure if you can see my hand up, so I hope you don't mind me just interjecting randomly. Just following on from what Councillor Yip said, actually, I mean, I was at an engagement event yesterday, with parents, and again, timelines came up there. So I do actually agree with Councillor Yip. We do need to make sure that we've got timelines in place, and that's something that we do need to work on. It's difficult to say hold us to account if we haven't got a deadline that we're being held to account to. So I will take that up with Sue Harrison. Victor is right; it's not just all in our gift in terms of the council side of it, but there has to be some common agreement across the board on what timelines and deadlines look like, and the fact that they have to sort of be stuck to, because things do slip, and we need to try to make sure that we're on track as much as possible in order to monitor.
If I may, through you, Chair, I want to thank the Cabinet member for taking that on and appreciate her commitment to that. It's very appreciated.
Yeah, thank you, Councillor Thompson. Much appreciated supporting the committee on that. Victor, would you like to continue?
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Chair. So, as I promised previously, we will be the importance of data, and this slide exemplifies why data is important. What a SEND dashboard will enable us to do is to analyze data, trends, historical benchmarking with other local authorities and national, identify data quality issues, display the business's key performance indicators and assess performance measures, generate actionable insights, which will help in terms of our commissioning arrangements and intentions, and of course, improve cognition and interpretation of that data. Next slide, please. Myself there. In terms of next steps, working closely with our partners, we are developing that monthly timetable for time collection of the data. We will be developing a standards operating procedures for consistency on data reporting. We'll make the dashboard available for the SEND board on a monthly basis. We will be updating the key performance indicator methodologies with current information, and of course we will work closely with the project team stakeholders on the navigation of the dashboard. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. I think the next slide.
The Wi-Fi here makes it very slow. Sorry.
No worries, Sherry. So the next slide actually exemplifies. So that is page 34 of the pack. The objectives in the accelerated progress plan at a glance, so that people remind themselves with it. There it is on the screen, that people remind themselves with it. So in the next slides, what we've done is picked up key data on each of the objectives, and I'm going to run you through it now. So if you don't mind, next slide. And I genuinely do apologize. My voice seems to leave me little by little, but surely. So in the following slide, there is so that would be page 35 of the data pack. That is a trend around the local offer. So when the local offer website was relaunched in April 2021, the number of unique views for that website was 15,252. That has gone up and down. But in the past 6 months, so that means July to December 2021, there was an average of 24,000 unique page views for the local offer, which is an improvement on average of 10,000 extra views per viewing for the website. This shows that at the moment, more people are using the local offer website. It might show that it is in a better state than previously was. I said might, because it's not necessarily a direct correlation. but what it just shows is that more people are using it and more people know of it. Next slide. Sorry, Councillor.
Move on. I think we have a question from Councillor Sabat-Plyer.
Yes, hi, thank you. How are you guaranteeing the quality of the EHCP plans?
So I think that refers to the previous slide, the Accelerated Progress Plan.
Yes.
I wonder if it would be okay, Councillor Scott, if I answered that, because it's more appropriate probably for me to answer that.
No, fine.
It's it's a very helpful question, because you will find on Getting the Basics Right, we'll be explaining that we are completely reviewing. We have a multi-agency core group who are reviewing the whole of our quality assurance programme, which is actually not just at a what the plan itself, but also all the component pieces of advice, so that we're all working to exactly the same standards. We'll be peer reviewing and moderating all of the plans and the advice. So we're working on that framework. We've stopped the previous framework because actually it wasn't helpful. The core group is reviewing that. It's got psychologists, it's got health colleagues, Birmingham Children's Trust, etc. So it's a wide multi-agency group. We'll all be following exactly the same system of quality assurance. Through that process then, that from our part, from a CENAR part, and from our colleagues in other agencies is where that comes from. But then back, we will be working on a system with parents so that they can also give feedback at every stage in terms of what they perceive is, and it's usually about the accessibility of the advice. Is it easy read? Are there too many accidents? And again, the same with the plan. So, but that's very helpful. We'll ensure that that's picked up in more detail and getting the basics right next time.
I think Councillor Meyer has a supplementary question.
Yes. Could you possibly tell me when did this framework come into place, and has it shown an improvement in the HSCP plan?
No, so we're working on that at the moment. So, you know, we've talked about timeframes. We're doing pilots from April. We would expect to have that fully in place by the latest July. We do have individuals. So each agency is looking at their own advice now, but it's not in a coordinated way that we're all following exactly the same procedures. So therefore, you're not actually getting a real assessment of the quality, which is what you've asked for, until everybody's following exactly the same framework. So we expect to be piloting straight after Easter, but the key thing is, and we'll be talking to parents about that as well, we would expect to have it in place by July.
Okay, thank you very much for that. And if you don't mind, I'd like to just stick with that topic of the EHCPs for just a moment. In my very, very recent experience, the quality of the EHCPs that are currently going out is really, really poor. The question I'd like to ask off the back of what you're saying there now is, how do we make immediate changes to the quality and the impact of those EHCPs on the children that they're supposed to be serving right now? So the current EHCPs that are landing on parents' doorsteps in draft format for them to assess and amend, etc. How do we support the parent through that process now, rather than waiting till July?
I think there are, if I might say so, I think perhaps there are two different issues here. One is, let's just talk about quality and what's within a plan. interestingly, you know, I said we'd increase management capacity yesterday with somebody else who is a very experienced person, and that's exactly what they've got to do. That's exactly what they've been brought in to do, to actually look at not just speed's an issue, and rigor for quality. So we're having to increase that. We have lots of our staff are experienced, and so lots of the new agency staff are saying these aren't good enough. There's often a lot of the permanent staff that need to do the shift because they're used to poor quality. So that's what we've got to keep doing. We've got to bring, as I say, we've brought in someone else who can really focus on this. I think there's a slightly different issue about how the parents feel about this. And that's one of the things that we're talking about in terms of the clarity. So sometimes parents are complaining about that they don't understand some of the terms being used. Now, there are two things there. At the moment, they can get more information from Senar. Once they've got named people, which will be after, you know, when they come back after the Easter holidays, as it were, that would be easier. They'll have somebody straight away to ring and say, I don't understand what this means. Fine. So that will help parents. And then ultimately, as we move forward and it changes all of the paperwork that we've got, all of that is trying to align it. Well, first of all, we're just trying to align it to the code of practice. I mean, we're at that stage at the moment. But we will be looking to see how accessible, and that's so much where parents come in terms of co-producing all of those things. So it's accessible to parents, which is where lots of the problems are occurring. Just as you've rightly raised, Councillor Scott, we've got too many acronyms in these slides. Well, actually, there are far too many acronyms. You would need to be quite savvy in terms of the legislation to be fully appreciative of some of our
Thank you for that very comprehensive response, and I will now allow you to continue with your presentation, Victor.
Thank you, Chair. So in terms of objective 2, one of the key important pieces of data that the DFE is always very keen on is the percentage of EHC needs assessments. So that's education, health and care needs assessments that are done within 20 weeks, completed within 20 weeks. For the past year, for 2021, I'm happy to report that 60% of the 1,229 EHCPs that were issued within 20 weeks. The reason why I'm saying I'm happy to report is because that's actually an increase from the year ending in May 2021, which was 53%. Also, in terms of national average, that compares with the national average of 58%, which means as of now, we are better than national average in terms of the timeliness of education, health and care needs assessments. Next slide, please. Also, we're fully aware, and we've reported that to committees before, that the timeliness of annual reviews actioned within the statutory timescales of 4 weeks of the annual review meeting being held has been extremely low in Birmingham. In April 2021, only 1.5% of annual reviews actioned were done in 4 weeks. So happy to say that in December 2021, due to the recruitment drive in Senar, we have managed to do 37.2% of the annual reviews within 4 weeks. Now, I'm not saying that's good enough, because it isn't. What I'm saying is that it's an improvement trajectory rather than anything else. We need to do better, but at least there are some green shoots regarding it. Next slide, please.
Victor, we have another question from Councillor Yip.
Thank you, Chair. Victor, so just dwelling on that a little bit. So the previous slide said the national average issued in 20 weeks is at 58%. In terms of where we are with the longest duration that someone has had to wait for in the HCP, have you got those statistics to hand?
I Thank you, Councillor. No, I wouldn't have that statistic at hand. And that's also not something that is, as far as I know, that is monitored by the DFE or nationally, so we wouldn't be able to compare. There might be plenty of reasons why an EHCP would be issued longer than 20 weeks, and the longest one, there could be all sorts of different reasons why it hasn't been issued, but I wouldn't be able to give you that information, I'm afraid.
So I'm sure us as councillors, I mean, we get lots of casework queries from residents who are particularly frustrated if they've had to wait a particular length of time. And my experience is that some of them had to wait over a year and a half, for example, for an EHCP and an EHCP review. So can I trouble you to try and get some statistics back to us on that Birmingham specific? I think statistics can be used to describe any number of things, especially if it's down as an average. So I'm always interested to see what the maximum number is, not just the mean and the median. Thank you.
Can I just check? Can I just come in there before Victor responds, please?
You may.
Yeah, I just want to acknowledge actually the hard work that's gone in by the department in terms of, we know we're not nowhere near where we need to be, but the fact that we've actually come above the national average is something that I think needs to be acknowledged. And the 37%, although again, it's not exactly where we would want to be, but that is a significant increase compared to where we was 6 months ago, let alone 12 months ago. So I just think that whilst I appreciate it's not where we need to be, and I know that and I keep saying this, not all parents and not all families will feel the impact of any improvements that are taking place at the moment. I just want to acknowledge that there are improvements taking place. It is an achievement to be above the national average in this one particular space, given where we've been for the last 12 months, and also that the 37%, because you know, our staff are working particularly hard in this area, and I don't want them to feel that members don't appreciate where there has been improvements.
Okay. Thank you, Councillor Thompson. Sue, you have a response?
Thank you, Chair. Thank you for that, Councillor Thompson, because we are starting from a very low base, aren't we? And I think we're being open about that. I know that health colleagues collect that median, longest wait, shortest wait, and they report that back at the improvement board. At the moment, it would cause us real significant issues to collect that data, because we're not digitalised in the way that we will be when we have Nexus. So I'm just asking Council to be patient. Absolutely, we would like to share that data, but I'm a bit worried about taking officers off other things to collect that data at the moment. If we can agree a timescale, and I'll talk to Victor about that, I would think that will be around September time when we've got a digital system, and it will be easy then to pull off the longest and the shortest time. Because I agree, averages do mask things. So I'm happy with it, but I wouldn't want to promise something and take officers off the work that they're doing now to collect that data. So I hope that's okay, Councillor and Chair. But we will certainly bring it at some point.
Okay, so what we'll do is we'll come up with compromise and say we request that information when it's available, and you will let us know the timeline.
We will.
That
We'll report
information
that alongside the data dashboard.
Yeah.
Because again, technically, I'm not sure how we would pull that off the system. So we'll do some work to make sure we're setting up a system that can do it. I'm sure there is a way, but we'll brief you on
Well, I
that.
too am conscious that we don't take staff off the day-to-day.
We really appreciate that. Thank you.
Jo, you had a question?
Thank you. Sorry, it's just moving away slightly from the data session we discussed about the average and what the data can do. But I'm also a bit concerned that it was raised before in objective one, just what support there was in place for parents during that time. Because while we're talking about the figures, and obviously I appreciate that it's going to take time to obviously look at that, but for a family that may have got caught in the crossfire of that long wait over a year, then just think about what support is in place for the family for that while they're waiting. Obviously, we spoke about the amendment and everything else, but we also have to consider ceases in that as well. That if something's been inappropriately ceased, obviously the family's not going to have support. So we just need to think about what that looks like and what we can do to by way of support to families during that time.
It's a very good point about the support for families. Sue, do you want to respond to that?
Yes, we're working with the Children's Trust and Ellison Homes on an early help offer and better access to an inclusive early help offer. And Pauline's just been in meetings this week about a kind of multi-agency front door to make sure that we are signposting early help and offering parents that. Sometimes it's moral support as much as practical support. Sometimes it is practical support that's needed. But the way to get that, I think, in a holistic way is through that early help, which again is something as the plans develop, we can bring back here to update you on.
Super. Sorry,
Sorry, I don't want to hold up a meeting, but again, I'm just thinking about the people that we are aware of. Because also if we have people in the pile that we know they're in the pile, so it's about how are we actually going and signposting those people that we know are already there, or is it for families to find their own way to like go back in with that approach?
Yes, thank you, Chair. Can I acknowledge and thank Sue for the compromise, and it's a very good way forward. Absolutely, we don't want to take time away from officers, and also I completely agree with what the cabinet member said around the hard work that officers have put in. I think it's also important to bear in mind, I think there's a backlog of some 9,000 EHCPs a couple of years ago that were waiting over 2 years. So there's been a significant amount of resource, extra office time, space that's been put in to deal with that backlog. And we just want to make sure that in terms of where we are now, that we're able to maintain that level of now, as you say, a higher level of efficiency if those resources are being redeployed back to where they originally were. So I think it's something that we, perhaps the committee, needs to just keep an eye on heading into the future. And as Sue says, statistics can be used and averages do mask a various number of things, but it's always those few families that are dealing with the most complicated cases that are waiting the longest. I think those are the ones that we need to have particular attention to. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much. Back to the presentation, please.
Thank you, Chair. Also, in terms of the percentage of needs meaning not young people above statutory school age that are not in education, employment and training that have an education, health and care plan. In May 2021, the percentage of that was 9%, so circa 990 individuals, circa 1,000 individuals that had an education, health and care plan, were above the age of 16 and were not in education, employment or training. As of December 2021, that figure has now dropped to around 650, which means 6.1%. National average is only 2.5%. So there is a question there in terms of first cleansing the data, because some of those individuals we don't necessarily know if they are attending a college or a training environment or a work placement. But there is something also around the necessity of the education, health and care plan, bearing in mind if the child or young person is not currently in education, employment or training, that they still have an education, health and care plan. And there is a question on whether or not that is still appropriate. Also, in terms of objective 2, sorry.
Don't mind. Children in education post 16 who are perhaps not on the radar but do need support, how are they being supported in education environments?
Apologies, Chair, would you mind repeating the question?
Okay, so I'm talking about children who are post 16 who are perhaps stayed in education but gone to colleges. How are they being supported if they come out of schools without a SEND support plan or an EHCP, but still have significant needs that the colleges are then having to cater to or for?
So if I understand the question, Chair, you're asking what happens with those children those young people, post 16 that are currently attending college and they have additional needs. If they have additional needs and they require an education, health and care plan and they don't already have one, most of them would already have one if they would require that support, because they would inherited it from secondary school or from primary school or from nursery. But if it is emerging needs that happen at college at post 16, the college or the young person, because they are over the age of 16, or the family can request an education, health and care needs assessment, and if deemed appropriate, they can get an education, health and care plan and be supported through that. If an education, health and care plan is not required, the college has a duty to support that young person at SEN support level, and the colleges do receive money from the Education Funding Agency in order to be able to do that. That is the equivalent in a primary school or a secondary school of SEN support money or notional funding or element 2 or whatever nomenclature people would like to use for that.
So just a supplementary to that, are you aware of the growing numbers of these children and young people who are getting into college and have those emerging needs? And are we monitoring it? Because it is becoming an issue. And is it our responsibility as a council to make sure they get that, or is it the Regional Schools Commissioner through the EFA?
So in terms of the legislation, in terms of the law and duties under the Children and Families Act 2014, the schools and colleges have responsibility to identify, assess and meet need for all children and young people that attend those environments if they have additional or special needs. If the school or college or early years provider is not able to meet need within their dedicated resources as per the notional funding or element 2 funding, as I said, the education establishment, be it a college or a primary school or secondary school or an early years provider, can make a request for an EHC needs assessment, and then that comes to the responsibility of the local authority to assess whether that particular child or young person requires provision in accordance with an education, health and care plan. If the child or young person does not require specialist provision in accordance with an education, health and care plan, then that responsibility reverts back to the schools or college and the Regional Schools Commissioner and the
Okay, thank you, that's very clear.
Thank you, Chair. Now, in terms of Objective 2, in Objective 2, we also have the health component to it, which is around waiting times for therapies. Apologies for the abbreviations on this slide. SLT stands for speech and language therapy. What you see in front of you on the left-hand side is a graph around the average waiting time for speech and language therapy, and on your right-hand side is the longest waiting time for speech and language therapy. To answer one of the previous questions the chair asked me in terms of what do those numbers signify, those are weeks. So in April 2021, the average wait time for speech and language therapy in Birmingham was 75 weeks. I'm happy to report that as of December 2021, that has actually gone down to 23 weeks. The NHS have worked extremely hard in order to get that down. Also, in terms of the waiting time for speech and language therapy, the longest waiting time in April 2021 was 108 weeks. It is now down as of December 2021 to 44 weeks. And just as a caveat, and this will be relevant for the following slides, as well, is that if only one individual is at that high 104 weeks, that in terms of occupational therapy, yes.
So don't wish to kill you in your stride, but to put you out of your misery, can we skip to the last slide and round up so that we can get in the final few questions, because we're pushing the time limits, I'm afraid, and that is our fault, not yours.
Of course, Councillor. So in the following slides, you can see all the waiting times in terms of NHS NHS waiting times, and I think one of the biggest concerns Ofsted and CQC reported during their revisit was around speech and language therapy, which has actually moved in a more positive direction. There's also data around there in terms of the neurodevelopmental pathway. We also talk about appeals and complaints. And I see that the presentation has taken off, and I do apologize if I've taken more of your time, but I can open, as the papers were distributed in advance, and I think they are published on the Birmingham City Council website. I'm more than happy to take any supplementary questions on the remaining slides for the expedient use of times, Chair.
Thank you. I think I have any indications? Sabia?
Thank you, Chair. Just a question, Victor, around the waiting time.
previously there was a challenge where we were told that the waiting times had been reduced, and when a deep dive was done, it turned out that it was only the fluency endocrinology cohort which only made up 32% of the waiting list. So can I just have reassurance, please, that when we're talking about the data on the waiting list here, it is the waiting list in its entirety and not a small percentage cohort that sits within these waiting lists?
Thank you very much, Sabia. Much appreciate the question. I would unfortunately be unable to respond to that, as I am not a speech and language therapist expert, and this is data owned by our colleagues in the CCG and the healthcare trusts. But this is a question we can take away and definitely come back with a response. Also, as part of, I think I am right in the cycle of the Overview and Scrutiny Committee, as Pauline said earlier. Next time is due getting the basics right, which the proposal is to split into two. One would be the CENAR element and the second would be the health element, which means that the second element, if agreeable to the committee, that comes in 2 months' time. There would be a deep dive with CCG colleagues in the room where those questions would be pertinent, and I'm sure they would have the answers at their fingertips compared to myself. That would do a complete justice to attempt to answer that question.
Thank you.
Thank you, Sabia.
Final question, I believe.
Yes, please.
Thanks, Rosella.
Sorry, Victor, I just want to clarify that when a child is identified as the child has a special need, between the school and the council, and obviously the additional funding has to come through, how long does that process take?
Apologies, Councillor. There was noise in the background. I think a car might have driven past your location, and I missed the middle bit of your question. I do apologize.
Just wanted to know, after identifying a special child need, what's the average time between the school and the council? Obviously, there is funding is required to help the school to cater for the child. So what is the average time it takes for that connection to be made?
So I think, thank you, Councillor, that is a very good and important question. Thank you very much for raising it. I think before I actually answer your question, I think it would be good for the committee to understand a bit of context around the legislation around this. So if a child is identified that has additional special needs, it is the school's responsibility to assess and meet that need. Schools have devolved funding from central government that comes directly from the school's block to meet need at SEN support level, additional support, that is called element 2. In terms of SEN funding, or in terms of schools funding, if you think about a school, there's 3 elements. Element 1 is what is called OPU, that is for every child in a school, it's normally around £4,000 per head per child. Then there is element 2, which is about £6,000 per child with SEN support. I'd like to make a caveat there. The school funding formula does not work exactly like that. It's not exactly per head. There is an extremely complicated formula with all sorts of factors, including deprivation, preschool meals, etc., that determine the amount of money that schools receive as element 2. So element 1 and 2, which is also called base funding, is about £10,000 for a child that has additional needs or special needs in a school. If a school is unable to meet the child's needs under that base funding of £10,000, the school can make a request for an EHC needs assessment and apply for additional funding to the local authority, and that is what we called element 3, or high needs funding. And that is given in accordance with an education, health and care plan, should an education, health and care plan be appropriate for that child or young person. I think it's also important to understand in terms of context that, as far as I am aware, primary schools and secondary schools in Birmingham receive an element 2 funding in total of about 160 something million as a total for schools in Birmingham, which is more or less an equivalent of the high needs block pot that the local authority holds as well. So there is not sufficient, but there is considerable funding within the city in terms of schools delegated funding as element 2 to support special needs. Now, if a school identifies the child has special educational needs, and they must use a graduated approach as per the Code of Practice and Code of Practice 2015 and as per the Children and Families Act 2014. A graduated response is an assess, plan, do, review methodology through which the school tries and supports the child or young person to achieve the best outcomes that they can, the desired outcomes that the child or young person has against the needs, the special needs that the child has. Now, if the school is unable to meet that need and achieve those outcomes through the delegated funding that they have, and they require further specialist support, the school can make a request for an EHC needs assessment. Now, going back to your extremely punctual question around how long can that take, there is absolutely no prescription in law as to how long that would take. You would have individuals who are extremely high complex need who would come from abroad, for instance, or they would come from a different local authority, so they wouldn't be known to the school until they just arrived with extremely high complex care needs, which is absolutely apparent that the school feels they would not be able to be in a position to meet that need from their delegated resources from the school, so that element 2 plus element 1, that base funding. And as a result, they would probably request a need assessment.
That's very clear. It's as long as a piece of string.
It is as long as a piece of string because it depends on an individual basis.
Okay, so I'm going to draw this section to a close so we can move on to the next item on the agenda, the very important work of the Birmingham Safeguarding Children's Partnership. And today I'd like to welcome Penny Thompson, Independent Chair of Birmingham Children's Partnership, and Simon Cross, Business Manager for BSCP in attendance. May I hand over to you, Penny?
Thank you very much. Have we got the slides, Simon? Yes, they're coming. I'm just conscious of time. Do you think do you want me to start? We're all right for time, are we? Yeah, okay. I'll calm down then.
So let us start. It's a bit of delay.
Penny, do you want to start? The system will catch up with you.
Yeah, okay. Good morning, everybody, and good to see you and for us to be here in person. I have to say this is only my second physical appearance in Birmingham in 2 years, which is quite extraordinary. It's been a bit of a shock to the system. What Simon and I hope to cover between us is the agenda that you see there. As you know, Chair, our responsibility is for the partnership to create the conditions for all of the organisations in Birmingham to work well together to safeguard children and to learn from incidents that happen. Sadly, inevitably, there will be things that happen, and it's important for us to learn. So that's what we were going to talk you through. Just to remind you that the national framework for safeguarding children changed in 2019, and actually we were an early adopter, so we moved in April 2019. I'll apologise now for this slide. First of all, it fails to mention that it isn't just the police who have accountability, but also the local authority in Birmingham, the Children's Trust, and also the NHS led by the clinical commissioning group. So that, secondly, I want to apologise for the acronyms. I'm also very keen not to have too many acronyms, and we've got 4 there. MASA is multi-agency safeguarding arrangements, and those are what replaced the local Safeguarding Children Board. Indeed, here we kept the nomenclature of local Safeguarding Children Partnership. And the other acronym is Child Safeguarding Practice Review, which is the system that replaced serious case reviews. the emphasis in the new arrangements is on learning, and it's on focusing on practice and speedily identifying what practice changes should be made, if any are needed. And I think there is some evidence, and we'll come on to that, that the new arrangements are working well. So now we have an arrangement where there can either be local or national reviews. The national reviews tend to be thematic. There have been a number of thematic, a small number of thematic reviews. The first review, national review, looking at individuals is now underway for Arthur Lavinjo Hughes, who, as you know, died in Solihull, and Star Hobson from Bradford. The other thing that changed with the new arrangements was that child death reviews, by which I don't mean safeguarding reviews, I mean any children who die, those reviews became the responsibility together of the council and the NHS through the clinical commissioning group, and that was a change. And again, the point of that was to get better and quicker learning from deaths of whole population deaths of children. So that's the national framework. As I say, we were an early adopter. Because I'd come in and reviewed our arrangements, in fairness, we made some changes, and we've just built on those going forward. Now, I wouldn't say that the national changes made a huge impact here, because we'd already changed. So then we move on to our priorities, and we're taking really a 2-year look at this. We're looking back at 2020 to 21 and 21 to 22, really. And I'll hand over to Simon to look at our priorities. Thank you.
Thank you, Penny. Every 2 years, we publish a new business improvement plan setting out our strategic priorities for that 2-year period. And the current plan, which you've got displayed on screen there, sets out the 4 strategic priorities. Strong leadership and strong partnership, demonstrating effective accountability. The second priority is continuous improvement of child safeguarding practice, and that's across the whole of the system and for individual agencies that are part of the partnership. The third priority is about developing an effective multi-agency response to child and adolescent neglect. And the fourth was evaluating and addressing the consequences of the COVID pandemic on safeguarding of children in the city. I'm going to move on to the next slide there, that as all plans you'd expect, they have quite detailed specific actions, and there are 33 within the plan. You'll be pleased I'm not going to go into each action specifically, but the slides give you a RAG rating of where we are and a key update on those. I'm just going to highlight some of those, but overall of the plan, that we 3/4 of the plan, we've made significant progress and completed actions, and the other areas that we are continue to progress, and there's some slippage, and I'll talk through some of that. So if I move on then to priority 1, this sets out around strong leadership and partnership, and I think one of the key things there is at each start of the financial year, we look at our audit and scrutiny programme, and that's very important for this committee as well, because we always want to complement the work of the scrutiny committee that's work taking place and the work programme. So we are not duplicating the effort, but we're adding the learning. And of course, our specific lenses, the focus is on partnership, safeguarding and practice. And so it's important that we continue to work closely together. On the second slide around that priority, the slippage area was we were hoping to remodernise our website, and this was also dependent on recruiting a comms and social media member for my team. That person is now coming into place in April, and we want them to work over that change program. It's about a 3-month when you take down a website to capture all the existing good practice to build into your new website. So that's ongoing work, and that's very much a website for frontline practitioners. Where do you go for your online procedures? Where do you go to get training, advice and support? And also for members of the public to have an understanding about what are we concentrating on for young people to be able to access it. Then moving on to continuous improvement of child safeguarding practice. Some slight slippage around, as you'd expect with the pandemic, around we've moved very quickly to transfer all of our training virtual. So frontline practitioners could access training when they could, and to make it sort of, and I think probably it's a hybrid model. I don't think we'll go back to all face-to-face training, because what we found was, for an example, at a conference where most of us will remember workshops you'll go to, you can only choose 2 out of about 6. And so what we found virtually, we put them on and everybody could go to every workshop if they wanted to. So what we got was a great coverage, and people really appreciated that, and not having to travel. So there is times when you can do some training online very effectively, but we still want to continue to do that. So the one area of slippage was we were hosting a session around a very core element of safeguarding practice, is understanding where early help ends, stepping up to children in need, and then in the most serious cases about child protection. So to work with professionals to understand that and how that works in Birmingham. So we will put that on in the new financial year, when we think there's confidence around professionals to come to a face-to-face session, but also for organisations to be able to be in a position to release staff, because there's still quite a pressure on frontline practice during this pandemic. Then moving on to the next slide around the safeguarding practice. We had a big emphasis around contextual safeguarding for the last 2 years, really, because it's a critical issue for us as a city around young people that are drawn into a criminal exploitation. County lines, the illegal supply of drugs, and we've had some key cases that are focused on that area. And so we have done some very good work, groundbreaking work around publication of a national review. It was hard to escape. Set out 15 key priorities for nationally, and we used that to benchmark where we were in Birmingham. And that's really kick-started some great work around early starting to think about what is the city's youth violence strategy, and how can we better integrate partnership working to tackle a child criminal exploitation. Then moving on into the third priority around child and adolescent neglect. Again, that work is working at pace. We're just about to receive a revised strategy around childhood neglect. And we are doing a comprehensive training program for frontline professionals that are dealing with identifying early signs of neglect. And we're doing some pilots in the south and north of the city around new models of working to try and actually break the cycle of neglect. And the fourth priority, really around the COVID pandemic and understanding and learning from. Next slide, please. Oh, it's catching up. Sorry. Yeah, there's always a bit of a drag on there. And that will become really our next phase of our report, where we're going to do a 2-year report looking specifically at the pandemic and the impact that it has had on safeguarding children. Because we've all had concerns around the hidden harm, particularly around lockdown periods when children weren't being seen by schools because they weren't attending schools. And we'll talk a little bit around a campaign. We realised there was increased drinking at home because people weren't going out socially to pubs and clubs. So there was more risk to children within the home settings, and I'll talk about the campaign around that. I think really I'm going to now hand over to Penny to talk about the independent scrutiny and challenge role.
Thanks, Simon. each year that I've been independent chair, I've produced an accountability report, and you usually seen that. You've got in front of you the report for last year. This year's report I haven't yet done because we do it on a financial year, so it's work in progress. But I hope you found that useful and providing of some assurance. I think it should. Unsurprisingly, I did focus quite a bit on COVID-19 and the impact of that on practice, because it has been significant. But I also update through the report on progress with our priorities. I think you'll see that I conclude by saying there was evidence of good progress in working together to safeguard children. And there was really a need for me to say a big thank you and to acknowledge how much practitioners in all the organisations had really continued to put children front and centre, despite the fact that the pandemic was impacting on them enormously. And I think it is really important to pay tribute to those who continued to work, who were seeing children face to face. That said, of course, I do raise in the report some of the impacts of COVID-19, and one of them, very sadly, was the upsurge in domestic abuse. Really significant, and we know now, a year on, I mean, I think I'll be talking about that again in this year's report. I mean, that shocking statistic of the police seeing a 50% increase, and in that December 2020, having 6,000 call-outs just in that 1 month is quite a powerful statistic. We also know that the educational and social impact on children of the pandemic was enormous. Children missed out on socialising, and they missed out on being seen. And I fear that that is going to be one of the themes perhaps in the reviews, the national reviews that are underway at the moment. The other thing that I raise in the report is the surge in youth violence. Whilst we were in absolute lockdown, that wasn't the case because people weren't on the streets, but once they were out, there was that surge. And there is the link, as Simon said, to criminal exploitation. I think in the last few years, the recognition that the young people caught up in this are victims quite as much as perpetrators, and the need to adapt our ways of working, which is what contextual safeguarding is about. It's saying that there are circumstances in which children need to be supported from harms that come from outside the family. This is not just about harm at home. I think that is something that has really gained our attention in the last year or two. But I also, in the report, focus on some of the perhaps unexpected benefits of the pandemic period. One, for example, being actually it did become a catalyst for people working together better. The Partnership Operations Group that came together very early on in the pandemic to make sure that practical working together was effective. That was really a good move, and the Partnership Operations Group continues and will be sustained. I think we found that attendance at virtual meetings was often better than at in-face meetings. And we also found, and one of the things that has surprised me, actually, it'll be in this year's report, the practitioner forum that I chair every quarter. Not only has it seen the attendance increase significantly, probably doubled or tripled, but I've also had the experience of people asking questions. When I made an off-the-cuff remark where I said, you know, if you'd been in the room together, I'd have introduced you to so-and-so, who I'm now virtually introducing you to. This person said to me, if I'd been in the room, I don't think I'd have asked the question. which was really interesting that some people feel more comfortable working in that virtual space. So I think there have been some benefits as well as disbenefits. And as Simon said, I fully expect that we're going to have a much more hybrid set of arrangements moving forward. One thing we've determined is we do hope to come back to having executive board meetings face to face, which they haven't really been for 2 years. But we've agreed that the subgroup meetings would be virtual in any event, out of choice. And I think we're going to be quite thoughtful and careful in how we use our time. I do think if we can have a face-to-face practitioner conference, that will be great. As Simon said, the online one was very successful, but we probably could have a hybrid, so we could record it and give access to people who aren't able to be there or to sessions that they missed. So that just gives you a flavour. As I say, I will be writing this year's report. It's very much a personal report, accounting for what I've been doing. You'll see from last year's one, I always get round all of the subgroups. I always have one-to-ones with the lead colleagues from all of the different agencies. We also are going to be meeting as the 4 safeguarding leads from this next month to just make sure we coordinate even better than we have been. I think the final thing I should say is to pay tribute to Simon and his team, because the job that they do to support me and to support the partnership is first class. And one of the advantages of being in a big city like Birmingham is the economy of scale means that we are able to invest in a team, and the benefit of that not only comes to Birmingham, but it comes to the whole of the West Midlands. Simon is far too modest to say it, but I'll tell you that he is the co-chair of the West Midlands Safeguarding group of chairs and business managers, and Birmingham's impact there is quite significant. And the work that Simon led on the development of our approach to rapid reviews, which is part of the new arrangements, has been used as a template for just about all the other authorities. And indeed, it's been used as a template beyond the West Midlands. And the only thing we've said is we give it away with pleasure, but we would like Birmingham credited. So I must end by thanking Simon and his team, because you there have a very knowledgeable, very committed team who are really supporting the partnership work. Thank you. And I'll hand over to Simon to give you a bit of information about our Who's in Charge campaign.
Yes, I just thought it would be helpful to show you the one of the Who's in Charge campaign films. This came out of the pandemic and responding to increased concerns around hidden harm in the home. We've had seen rises in accidents within the home with scalds, burns, and we had tragically a number of children, babies and toddlers falling out of windows, and luckily at that age you bounce a bit better, and so they didn't all die. But we got a theme where we could see this pattern, and so we needed to do some public awareness campaigns to make sure people were aware of that. And this Who's in Charge campaign came out of that, and we produced with Birmingham and Community Healthcare and the CCG and the West Midlands VRU provided some funding as well to produce a set of 5 films, and we tailored them for different audiences, a 2-minute version and a 1-minute version, because we're conscious that people, time is the essence. So we're going to show you a 1-minute one around safer sleeping, which is a key factor when we had it. practice, don't they? Every time, ding, ding.
It did just before we started. While that's waiting to come up, I'd just like to say it's really nice to hear that Birmingham kind of partnership is setting the scene nationally. That's excellent.
And the set of film.
We had a couple on the way home.
We're getting a bit buffering, but the link is there on your own slides, so it's well worth having a look, and you can access all of them. So we did 5. One was around 2 around the safer sleeping, because tragically we had young babies that have, when people have been sleeping with them on sofas, they've fallen down the side of the sofa, died because they've been dropped. And then we have, one of the films looks at 2 children holding pans of scalding water with the consequences, and then partying and leaving a front door open, and a toddler runs out into the road. And then we did one around people drinking in parks around by a lake, and the consequences that if you're not watching what they're doing, they can fall and drown. So they've gone down very well. We over 1 million views across the West Midlands. And it was picked up by the NHS, and we won the National Safety Award last year for the facility. And we just shared and said, they're not just burning, pick them up and use them. If it helps save another child, then please use
Very
it.
easy to underestimate the impact of something so small and so simple.
And the clever bit was, during the keep changing of the COVID restrictions, we targeted the films to be released at the right time, so they were contravening and they were complementing what the national message was, which was a bit of a skill thing, to try and over time. But now they can all be used. I think
we must give credit to Birmingham Community Healthcare Trust, because it was a senior manager there who really championed this and was passionate. As with many initiatives, it takes a person to drive it, and it was Catherine's, wasn't it? Her role was significant in that, and it was great that the whole partnership then wanted to get behind it.
That speaks of the respect that they have for what you do. So, which enables that to happen.
I'm going to move us on then and to talk around learning from case reviews. And this is sort of Birmingham and national. And the picture there are the ones that you're seeing on your TV. These are national cases. The first one is young Arthur, who has died, unfortunately, in Solihull. Star died in Bradford. Kimani died in West Bromwich. But they are, Kimani's in court at the moment, so you'll hear the cases that come out, the conclusion of these cases. The Arthur and Star cases have now, for the first time ever, have been subject to a national review of an individual case. This is the first time they've done it nationally. And the review process of that national structure and the local structure is about how we maximise the learning from nationally and from our own cases. In Birmingham, we are actively commissioning reviews. We have 8 on the go at the moment, looking at different aspects. We use them as a lens on the safeguarding system, looking at childhood asthma, the impact of that, neglect, safer sleeping, physical abuse, and domestic violence has been another issue of the common cross-cutting themes. The reviews look at quite the diversity of the city as well as different age groups, and that's where the review process supports. And it helps us with our case audits to try and see what are the emerging issues that we need to focus on. And I think the next slide picks up on the national learning, and Birmingham, as you'd expect, reflects, with the size of our city, the national issues. And with those, there are 6 practice themes. Frustration of it, yeah, sorry. So, and I'm going to reel through them. Just the understanding of what the child's daily life is like, and that lived experience of the child is always key in frontline practice. Working with families where their engagement is reluctant or sporadic, and that is a classic in neglect cases of some get engagement, then it drops off. Critical thinking and challenge by partners, to making sure we're getting the right decisions, and if we think it's wrong, making sure we escalate to get the right decision making going on. And of course, the thing that always comes out of effective information sharing, making it timely and in an appropriate way. And I think we've made some, we've got a CAS and a MASH system in Birmingham that helps tremendously in that area about effective information sharing. And of course, what we've said, which reflects in our priorities, about organisational leadership and culture for good outcomes. And I'm very proud of our approach in Birmingham. We are trying to be a learning culture. We want to learn and keep improving our practice. And I think we'd add to the other areas. One that we would say is for big cities, and for Birmingham, we think about cultural competency and confidence of our workforce to make sure we're getting it right. The area of weakness, though, I would say in local child safeguarding practice reviews is they don't really adequately cover serious youth violence. And this picture, very sadly, picks up on 4 of our young boys that have died as a result of serious youth violence. With Nazir, we conducted a child safeguarding practice review, which we think was very groundbreaking. We interchanged that with a benchmarking in the same review of the national review, It's Hard to Escape, which was published in March 20. And from that, it really helped kickstart our approach to tackling and managing serious youth violence. And the review really talked about reachable moments. And in a young person's life, though, when they're in crisis, that point when you're the first time you're arrested or you've gone missing and you're found, or you're in A&E with a horrific wound or injury, they are the moments when there's an opportunity for frontline practitioners to make that link, to break that cycle. And so we called it reachable moments because we want to train our staff to actually capitalise on them. Red Thread work in our A&E centres across the city. They're doing great work, specifically focused on that, trying to meet young people when these moments of crisis. But this case also made us did some work where we hosted a strategic leaders summit, which was co-chaired by Penny and Councillor Cotton, which actually helped to kickstart that development of our serious youth violence strategy, and that work is going ongoing. Moving on to what potentially looked like a solution that we are to the review process. The government going through at the moment through the Police and Crime Sentencing and Courts Bill are offensive weapon homicide reviews, which are specifically designed to try and look at those cases where you get stabbings and shootings, and we hope that was going to be a great opportunity. West Midlands has been selected for a pilot this year, but a fundamental flaw we think in the criteria is they put in the reviews of over 18s, and we've had since January 2000 11 homicide victims of children, and the suspects in those cases are children. So government-wide, we've written to the Home Secretary to say we think this is a real missed opportunity. Take out 18 out of it, because we want somewhere where we can get the whole learning, to get systemic change and learning. And so we would look very much for your support in putting pressure on the government to do that change. We think it's the right way to try and capture all that learning and to make a difference for us.
It has to be said, I mean, we jointly signed that off, Councillor Cotton and I, and we have had a very limp response, it has to be said, which didn't give us any basis for being optimistic. I cannot understand, particularly if you're having pilots, why you wouldn't want to test out the age range. We think that there may be a concern about just the volume, but actually if they learnt from the safeguarding practice reviews, the fact that we do rapid reviews in every case and only a substantial safeguarding practice review where we think that's going to add value, you could have a similar approach to these reviews. And we do think there's some transferable learning. But so far, it does seem to be falling on deaf ears, I think.
Before you continue, I'd like to ask members of the committee, would it be appropriate if we made a decision and voted on whether we should liaise with cabinet members, appropriate cabinet members, to write on behalf of the committee to support that initiative? Do we all agree? Okay, we make that noted that we're going to work with the appropriate members to support that initiative that we're doing. Because I think, you know, if you're getting limp responses, you want people to shout.
Thank you.
Okay.
Sorry, Tony. I think I'll hand over now, but Penny, just really to about looking ahead for.
Yeah, so finally, we just thought it's worth noting, obviously, we've got the Commonwealth Games. There is a theme there in terms of preparing for safeguarding, and Simon is working with key people in the Commonwealth Games organising group to ensure that safeguarding is on the agenda there. Just as an aside, it really did strike me that the issue in the Winter Olympics at the moment about doping, the one thing that never got mentioned is that the young person who everybody's talking about failing a drug test is actually a young person, is a 15-year-old. And what's the safeguarding implications for her? I mean, she's talked of as though she were an adult. Anyway, that's by the by. So we're doing that work. There is work going on with the Birmingham Council of Faiths, and we've been able to invest in some work together to help them with their safeguarding arrangements. That's across all of the faiths in Birmingham. If you're interested, Simon can tell you more about that. He's already referred to the serious youth violence to Everyone's Invited, which is the campaign that came out of the murder of Sarah Everard. And the whole issue about respect and consent, I think, is a very key one. And again, I think in Birmingham, the initiative that we have with many of the schools, the UNICEF initiative around rights and responsibilities, is a real opportunity, and is something, again, that we think we need to really support, because if children and young people know their rights and their responsibilities to one another, that helps them to be safeguarded. We are focusing on childhood neglect, and we hope that that's going to be the theme of this year's practitioner conference. But I must emphasise that investing in early help and family support is absolutely critical, and it is really important that we do not pathologise the poor and start talking about them neglecting children when actually they're enduring poverty. We, as we referred to earlier, we have got some resources there. There is a programme manager who is leading the work for the partnership on neglect, which is really positive. And this year we will be, instead of doing a 1-year annual report, we'll be doing a 2-year annual report, for the Safeguarding Partnership, looking at 20 to 22, and particularly focusing on the impact of COVID. Because, there is no doubt it has been significant, but we will also try and highlight the advantages and those things that have moved forward quite as much as the negative issues. So that's our presentation. We're very happy to answer any questions that you may have, and if we're not able to answer them, to come back to you in writing. So thank you.
Thank you, Penny. Thank you, Trustee Simon. First indication of questions was from Councillor Yip.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Penny. It's nice to see you again, Simon. Thank you very much for what you're doing over 5 years, I understand.
Where is the time going?
It really has. I've got a number of points, but I think just the time I'll rattle through them as quickly as I can, so I hope you forgive my brevity. I think the videos were fantastic. I saw them before the meeting. I've got a little one just walking down the stairs with him is a frightening experience, let alone, as you say, some of the issues that can come if you're just unfortunately a little bit careless. Due to no fault of people's own, and it's just about the education. So I really do welcome 1 million people views. I mean, that's incredible. In terms of the 4 priorities, so leadership, you touched on how there's been 6 years in your time. Obviously, you've got a new DCS. I think it's a real opportunity now with Sue that we've got some stability in that, and I do welcome that, and hopefully we can see some real changes because of that stronger, more continuous leadership. Touching on the 20-odd actions, so I was a little bit disappointed that some of the actions were just in terms of holding a forum, doing a meeting, etc. I quite like to have statistics to see where we are, where we'd like to go, and then in terms of holding people to account. So if I may push you ever so slightly in terms of trying to have slightly more challenging actions, perhaps more statistical based, more ones in terms of where we can see driven improvements as opposed to more centred around the actual physical work of the partnership board, if I may. In terms of national views, so you've got a number of national views coming up, I think it's 8 that you mentioned. So if you can give us some sort of a reply, feedback into the outcomes of those to Scrutiny, it's just the documents that are quite helpful for us to see where we are with those. And then the main substantive question, if I may, Chair, it was around a Birmingham Mail article that related to how some 3,500 Birmingham pupils eventually back in school after lockdown closures and inverted commas they've disappeared. And Birmingham is then identified as a national hotspot. So this is an article that was a couple of weeks back. And they identified 7 children as most likely to fail to attend. There's, of course, the council's response, and it does link into the Treasure Education Bath that we understand was a Birmingham child for a short period of time. So I think this crosses over slightly to what Lisa and Alan were saying, but I think my actual substantive question would be around what are we doing specifically to look at those. I think my concern with a 2-year plan is that it doesn't really address the phenomenal changes that's come on since 2021. So you mentioned, for example, domestic violence cases, COVID in terms of the suffering for education for children, and in terms of gang-related exploitation, etc., long-term issues, for example, mental health. So it's frustrating that those aren't mentioned, understandably, in 2021. If it's a 2-year plan, I think it's appropriate for us to have some sort of revision where we are going forward in 2022, mindful of the size of the changes, to try and take into consideration, maybe try and get some more action specifically, even if it's just creating a 5th priority specifically on this to really drive down some of the changes since the plan was put in 2021. Those are all mostly comments. Perhaps the question will be mostly related to the missing children, and if there's anything that we can do, some information on that, please. I'm looking at.
Okay, thank you. Just let me respond initially. I'm really pleased that you do like the films. That's great. And I absolutely know that you like statistics. Be assured there's a quality impact and outcomes group of the Safeguarding Partnership, which has a quite simple but effective approach to quality. So looking at quantitative and qualitative and experiential feedback. And I'm sure we can show you more statistical. My accountability report is very much what it says on the tin. It's my accountability for what I've been doing. But I'm sure we can give you more statistical information, and be assured but it is important that quantitative data on its own is not sufficient. I think it's really important that there's also qualitative audit work and also feedback from those who use and experience services. We will, of course, feedback on the national review when it comes. And as the example that Simon used of us using the thematic national review in a youth violence case to then benchmark our own services is indicative of our approach. So be assured we will use that. I think I attended yesterday the Safeguarding and Education group, and I think Lisa would attest to the fact that the issue about children who are not in school was one of the matters that was discussed there, and I think will get dealt with actually probably in the next section of the agenda.
So is that what you wanted to come back on?
Yes.
Yes. Do you want to just dip in?
Yes. Do you want to come in?
Yes, I just wanted to say, reassure that we're taking this extremely seriously. And of course, it shouldn't really come as much surprise, should it, after having a couple of years of saying you don't have to go to school, it can all be virtual, keep the country safe. To do a U-turn and then expect children to suddenly be back in that routine was always very optimistic, shall we say. So I know that partnership working is always important, but never more so than now, around, first of all, reassuring some very nervous parents who are still nervous about potential impact of COVID and the risk of infection. But also, to be frank, some children have just got out of a routine and it's very hard to get them back into it. There's some really interesting work going on around the smallest of our children who haven't had those socialisation opportunities to encourage them to get back into nursery, to get back into early years education. And again, I understand if there's no siblings and they've been with mum on their own for 2 years, the culture shift of then entering a group of youngsters and learning to play and learning to share.
I'd like to expand on this in the next section, actually, if that's okay. Yeah,
I think it's absolutely pertinent, isn't it?
Sorry, I couldn't interrupt you there.
No, sorry to be going on. It really links though with the safeguarding board, and there are lots of links there.
It does, and in fairness, I think quality, impact and outcomes, one of the issues that group raised quite some time ago were issues related to absence or not even being on school roles. So there is, definitely there is a link across. Finally, you raised the issue of revision of the plan. I'm not sure that we need to, but I mean, we'll take it away and look at that. Actually, our practice priority is open enough to be able to flex. And actually, the previous plan did have some of these matters in it. And actually, the fact that we'd set up the hub meant that there was a sense that actually quite a lot had been achieved. But I take that point. Thanks.
Thank you.
Brilliant. Don't believe there's any other indications to speak, but I would want to ask a couple of questions.
Yes, of course.
I'll do it very quickly. In fact, I'll just focus on where early help and child in need begins. What do we do that needs improving? What do we do that's good practice? Where are the gaps that us as a city or us as a committee can help you with? That's my only question. The rest of it is value.
I mean, I think the development of local provision for early support is absolutely key and fundamental, and building on work that's already been done. To be honest, I'd like an update myself on how the local offer is going, because that also seems to be key. The other thing I think that has started and needs to be supported is the team around the child. So, and this is something that I know the Children's Trust has done to link staff with schools so that schools do feel connected and supported, because very often schools will notice first that there's something awry. And one of the things we discussed in the meeting yesterday was how the arrangements are going between the police and schools for notification where there's been a domestic abuse incident. There's meant to be a scheme, a voluntary arrangement now where information would be passed to schools to alert them to the fact there's been a domestic abuse incident. So they are sensitive to perhaps behaviour that might appear in the child the next morning. So I think it's reinforcing the support for schools and the local arrangements for early help and support. And of course, anything that can be done to improve opportunities for people to have gainful employment, so they earn a reasonable amount of money so they're able to feed, clothe, home and care for their children. Because what we don't want is, and we know is the case, that the poverty is an issue.
Also, we need to work more on those reachable movements that you mentioned as well in that arena or sphere.
Yes, absolutely. Again, there's a training issue, and we're seeking to support frontline practitioners to understand about this notion of reachable moments. Red Thread, who Simon mentioned, is a voluntary organisation that's being deployed in hospitals to be able to link with young people when they have been on the wrong end of some violence and where that might be a reachable moment. But we also want police colleagues to be aware of it. You know, the reachable moment might be in the back of a police car when they've been picked up. So this is a training and awareness issue as well as a resource issue. And frankly, learning and development never stops. You can never get to the point of saying we've done it. It's a continuous process, as is assessing, planning, implementing and reviewing. You know, nothing is static.
I think it's probably also important to just remind people as well, in January we refreshed the city's multi-agency threshold guidance, Right Help, Right Time, which enables all frontline practitioners to understand levels of need and how to access the right service based on a family and child's level of need. And we are also looking at refreshing the e-learning package to actually get out to a wider audience so people understand that. But it's not only understanding, can you apply it as well?
Okay, I'd just like to take a moment to thank you so very, very much for coming in. It's always absolutely fascinating and motivates me immensely.
That's nice.
So thank you very much both of you for coming in, Penance on. And I apologise for going over time. Such is my habit. Can't help myself. We will move on now to school exclusions, and we'd like to welcome Lisa Fraser, AD for Education and Early Years, and Alan Mitchell, Service Head of Service for Administration. Over to you, please.
Thank you, Chair. Good morning, colleagues. So we have prepared, and I hope you've had a chance to have a look at the presentations. It's just put together. As we're probably running short of time, I'm just going to highlight a few things from the presentation, if that's okay. So our aim was to update you on permanent exclusions and suspensions, particularly with a particular focus on children with SEND for the period 2019-21. Obviously, the same caveats exist as for when we talked about attainment in the last scrutiny presentation in terms of the data which is available, which relates to the COVID period. So obviously very different times, and we see in the data, the national data and the Birmingham data, a different picture. We also aim to highlight some of the initiatives that have impacted on exclusions, particularly managed moves, the work of sharing panels, and some other initiatives which have been developed with our multi-agency partners, such as the Tackling Exclusions Group, and then set out the next steps and ongoing work in this area. And I believe that Pauline Madison is online too, and she will input into this session. So that is the plan for this presentation. As I said, slide 3 relates to the fact that the data looks very different because of the COVID period, so we have to take that into consideration. But I really want to highlight that there has been quite a bit of discussion and work with a range of agencies around exclusions in Birmingham over the past 12 months. But I really wanted to emphasise that the primary phase is the phase which is the most significant issue for the city. So if you look at slide 4, and data which is available through the LA data matrix, you will see that compared to the other 152 local authorities, we're ranked in quartile D for permanent exclusions in primary, and that is a persistent and stubborn issue over a couple of years that we need to address as a city. So looking at the secondary PX, the permanent exclusions, is a more positive picture, and a more positive picture in terms of suspensions, which you'll have to forgive me. I tend to go back into old parlance and talk about fixed term exclusions. I think I'm at the age in my life where things are beginning to go round again, and so apologies if I slip into that. So slides 5 to, I think, 8 are really just exemplifications of what I've said in terms of the issues for the city. Slide 5, emphasising the issue at primary over a number of years, all those reds, slightly more positive picture in secondary. And if you look at slide 6, you'll see in terms of how we compare against our statistical neighbours and our core cities, a similar picture. The reds are most definitely in the primary phase, a more positive picture in the secondary. It's a fairly similar situation when we move on to look at suspensions in slide 7. So you'll see that primary is red, whereas the picture in secondary is more positive. And the same situation in terms of comparing us to our statistical neighbours and core cities on slide 8. So in terms of exclusions data for SEND pupils, and we'll talk a little bit later in the presentation about what we're doing in terms of our activities, but in terms of the data, we see that permanent exclusion rates for children with EHCP have risen against a national reduction. So that is a key cohort whose needs we need to address. And although the permanent exclusion situation is better for children with SEND support in that it looks like the gap between national is diminishing, rates are still too high for this cohort of students. We also find when we look at the data that permanent exclusion rates are higher in our special schools. However, I must emphasise that we're talking about very low numbers of students who are permanently excluded from the special schools. So I think if we're looking at current data, it's around 3. So really small numbers of students. And I think looking over the past few years, the highest number was 6. So we need to bear that in mind. But obviously, we need to work to avoid those situations for those pupils. And as I've said, suspension rates have fallen for all SEND children, but the Birmingham rates remain lower than the national. So slides 10. Slide 10 is an exemplification of that in terms of the data. And you'll see a more positive picture in terms of the suspensions in green, but we do in terms of those permanent exclusions. So if we come on to look at ethnicity, I'm going to hand over seamlessly to my colleague.
So some comments, providing some headlines for the next 4 slides around the issue of ethnicity and also geographical or school patterns. Exclusions and ethnicity, very complex area, lots of research in this area. We could take up a whole session just looking at this. The information in front, as indicated, gives figures broken down by particular ethnic categories for both the permanent exclusions, but also suspensions. And we can see Birmingham mirrors the national picture, and there are many reasons why it is the case that there are higher permanent exclusions and suspension rates for black pupils, white and mixed pupils, and lower rates for Asian pupils, Asian ethnicities. And it's also significant that there has been the largest reduction in Birmingham is related to children from black ethnicities, with a 47% reduction and 35% reduction in suspensions. That's in the 1920 year compared to 1819. Go to the next slide, which provides some further information with a larger breakdown of ethnic groups. And it's worth just drawing attention to ethnicity unclassified. With ethnicity, it's self-reported by families, and not all families necessarily report. So where there isn't a reported ethnicity, that explains that category. But it is important to understand that it is about self-reporting. I think also important to understand that the percentages are of the particular cohort based on the incidences of suspension. So that just explains a little bit about the percentage figures. Going on to exclusion rates across schools and districts, I think a key message here is that both permanent exclusions and suspensions are variable in a number of ways. We've touched on ethnicity previously, but also by geography and by school. So bullet point 2, very interesting, 87% of primary schools made no permanent exclusion in 2019-20. 32% made no suspension. So that's just reinforcing that some schools will be excluding, other schools won't be. And there's a multitude of reasons why that is the case. Not quite as diverse and variable at secondary level, but nonetheless, 40%, just over 40% of secondary schools made no permanent exclusion in that same period. The next slide gives a sense of distribution of exclusions by geographical area. And it is by school rather than by the home address of the child. And of course, if you layered those maps on top of each other, you would get some big differences, because some schools will take in from quite a local catchment area. Other schools, some of those schools within the more inner city areas, you would have Ladywood and Perry Bar, would be taking children from across the city. So you've got an interesting interface between the school and also demographics that are different based on which school you were talking about. So they can be more diverse, less diverse, from a wider area, from a much smaller area. And that's what the exclusion rates across schools and districts is showing us. So it's got some areas where they're higher than the average, some areas where they're lower, but that's on location of the school and exclusions from the school, not the wider localities.
Just a question about that. Don't mind. If a school has higher suspension rates and very low permanent exclusions, what does that signify to you?
I mean, it's a very interesting question, the correlation between permanent exclusions and suspensions. Very interesting. But it's not straightforward, because you could see, if you look at a school on a journey, that it has a view it's got some real significant behaviour issues, and there is a new behaviour policy introduced, and it's very robust, and it's been implemented rigorously. You would probably see an increase in both suspensions and permanent exclusions, potentially. But equally, you could argue that where a school is using suspensions efficiently, that could see a commensurate reduction in permanent exclusions. Given all other things being equal, it's complex counselling.
What I'm alluding to is breaking down the reasons for suspensions or exclusions, so that we have a real understanding of backgrounds to why certain schools do more or less, or certain areas do more or less. And if we could just push into that narrative a little bit more, that would be really helpful. Even just a minute. Sorry, continue.
Yeah, I can touch on that with some headlines now, if that's helpful.
No, carry on, but you can come back to us on that.
So that's the picture in terms of the data across the city and what we're doing about it. Well, a number of things. So when we look at slide 15, you will see information on the audit initiated by the Birmingham Children's Partnership in 2019, which looked at, I think, 10 case studies of primary age children who had been permanently excluded, and looked at the reasons for this and the circumstances that those particular children and families found themselves in. And it made a series of recommendations, and some of which were action was taking place already, and some of which I would have to say the activities have improved over the course of the pandemic. So I'm looking at those bullets, and particularly the first one, the effectiveness of early health intervention, coordination and communication with schools. And I know from, I attended Primary Forum this morning, that primary schools feel that they, although it's not perfect, that they understand the early help in the localities, systems and protocols and procedures that have been put in place, really initiated by the Children's Trust. So that is an area which I think is improving. The audit also highlighted the need to use the additional skill sets offered by partners, training and support for school governors prior to exclusion, so that they're aware of what early help is available to schools. So that was an interesting one, because we had always done training and support to governors around statutory responsibilities in terms of exclusions. But what we have done since this audit is to do a session led by a colleague from the Children's Trust specifically for governors, so that they understand what sort of early help and support and intervention is available across the city, so that they can gauge how well their particular schools are tapping into that in terms of providing support to children to help them to avoid exclusion. Also highlighting the work of Forward Thinking Birmingham and the Education Psychology Service, and further work on understanding the lived experience of children, and considering the impact on family life of issues such as domestic violence. And one of the particularly interesting aspects of our work was we had an apprentice a young apprentice who was working for the Children's Trust, who interviewed some children who had been permanently excluded, who were based at COBS, and talked about their experience of exclusion and then life after exclusion. And that was a really interesting conversation around that. In terms of our ongoing work to reduce exclusions, I'm going to touch on a couple of initiatives, which is not exhaustive, but a couple of initiatives, particularly in terms of the Tackling Exclusions group. Alan's going to give us some more detail on the sharing panels, and then I'm going to highlight some very sort of recent strategies which have been backed and funded by central government, particularly in terms of the Safe Task Force, and then other support that's available for teachers' professional development, which is very much driven through our Birmingham Virtual School, and I'll explain the reasons for that when we get there. So in terms of the Tackling School Exclusions group, this group came about as a result of that audit, which was initiated by the Children's Partnership. It's got colleagues from education, from the Trust, from health and police, and its aim is to develop an integrated systems offer via partnership, and so that there is a whole system approach to providing support to children and their families, which will hopefully result in reduced exclusions. It's been a really interesting forum, not least because it's been interesting for partners from different disciplines to understand what is the limitations of statutory responsibilities in this area. But we have achieved a few things so far, which are highlighted. More specifically, we've revised the Right Help, Right Time framework so that any children at risk of primary school exclusion, permanent exclusion, need to be referred into CAS, and that's mandatory. As I said, the early help offer through the trust in locality teams has been improved. We've now got data sharing processes in place between education and the trust, so that the trust can see, in terms of when they look at the city or particular schools, where there are increasing numbers of suspensions or exclusions, where they can contact schools to make sure that they're aware of what early help is available in their particular localities. I've talked about the training to school governors. I'm very grateful to the Trust for supporting us with that. And I've talked about the voice of children, and that was the forum where we heard from the children who had been permanently excluded. And it was really interesting and surprising, I think, to some of us, that the children who had been permanently excluded talked about their positive experience of education post-exclusion through COBS. And there are a range of reasons for that, not least the working in smaller groups and a more closer relationship with teaching staff. So I'm going to hand over to Alan now to come in on managed moves and sharing plans.
Before we move on, does anyone have any questions? Because I can hear those and what's been said so far. Alex, would you like to go ahead?
Thank you, Chair. Just very quickly, I think there's, of course, it's concerned that exclusions are so high at primary level. Obviously, the consequences and knock-on effects with that. You say that how the numbers are stubbornly high in Birmingham. So I suppose the first question is, what particular factors do you feel make Birmingham relatively stubbornly compared to the national? You mentioned in terms of the ethnicity population breakdown being higher than the average. I assume we're not taking into consideration how Birmingham's got a higher ethnicity breakdown. So I assume those numbers are skewed against us. Would that be fair?
So the figures are based on the incidence of suspension, and the same for permanent exclusion against the particular number in the cohort. So you are comparing the incident in a cohort.
So it's not taking into consideration the higher density of ethnicities in Birmingham. So I suppose it's skewed against us, but it's a minor point. In terms of percentages, so you say 13% of schools are making the exclusion. So again, it seems that's a relatively small number. Not sure how we can try and target support to those schools individually. I remember previous scrutiny we were talking about a lot of the work that we're doing in terms of trying to manage exclusions around working relationships as trying to ask nicely sort of approach as opposed to any sort of stick or carrot that we can effectively use. So and I suppose it's good that there are a number of people who have moved on and positive experiences post-exclusion at COPS. I think that is a good overall. So perhaps mainstream isn't the place for some. So there is a positive outcome to say. But then there's some underlying concerns. We've looked at this for quite some years. It seems that we're no further along in terms of against national average, in terms of numbers, ongoing issues.
I'd just like to comment on just smidge that you mentioned there. COPS is, when you said that mainstream isn't the place for some because COPS is working, I think it's the other way around. Mainstream isn't doing what COPS are doing to enable them to access their education in mainstream school. In an ideal world, we wouldn't need COPS. So please respond.
If I could just quickly come back, I think in an ideal world, we shouldn't have exclusions.
No.
If children are going to that school to learn, they should be at that school to learn. You shouldn't be allowed to exclude. It's kind of like my point of view, but that's a little bit
So in terms of why are exclusions higher at primary, I think it's interesting. I went through this data at Primary Forum, and I would have to say that part of the role of the local authority is to shine a light on data and make sure that everyone is aware of it. And it came as something of a surprise to primary heads, colleagues, that the data was so high in comparison to the national. So already I think that is a useful tool in helping people to reflect on that. Alan and I had some discussion around why it was higher at primary. And and this is not a scientific response, but we talked about the real focus on in terms of the national strategies and all of that work that happened quite a few years ago, and the real emphasis on behaviour and attendance, which really focused on the secondary. So that might explain why there's a disparity between the primary and the secondary. It's fair to say, though, when we look at the attendance data for the primary phase 2, that there are issues there. And again, when I've shared that data with the primary heads, that has come as a surprise. So I think in terms of moving it forward, I think there's a good understanding of how we compare against national and a sense of surprise, if not shock. But these, as I've highlighted, these initiatives that we've undertaken, particularly in the last 12 months, and I'm going to further elaborate on some other things that we're doing, will take time to embed. But I think there is a sense of shared purpose in tackling this issue with primary heads, and I think that can be positive.
Jay? Sorry, quickly on that point then.
It's just a quick plug for our inclusion conference, because we're going to be holding a sort inclusion conference with all our head teachers, and then on in the autumn for governors. Because I think an important point for this committee is, how our governors supporting school attendance, because it is governors at the end of the day that decide to exclude children and make that decision. So I think there's more fruitful work we can do to have that interesting discussion about what does good inclusion look like in Birmingham. Thank you. Thank you, Chair. Just following on from the inclusion points, but a bit similar. So a couple of things I want to pick up. I know that, sorry, I'm not doing that. Specifically, we spoke about black children and that being the biggest kind of improvement figure. So I just want to ask a question. Has more deep dive learning done around that, or do we have anything to why we think it looks like that basically that's the biggest improvement? And do we have any feedback away further information?
We haven't done any deep dives in Birmingham that I'm aware of, but there is a raft of research around the different experience for black young people, black students in schools. And there are a range of subjects that are touched on, and there are a range of different views, it has to be said as well. It is a very complex area. And things are raised around the effectiveness of behaviour policies in schools. It can be around the quality of teaching and learning. It can be related to the nature of the curriculum, the accessibility of the curriculum, how it's differentiated. There's such a raft of factors that will contribute towards that outcome. But there hasn't been a deep dive done to date within City.
I think just to come in on that, there has been work which has been initiated with schools around anti-racist policies and discriminatory practices. So, but in a positive sense. So I think that might have impacted, and we certainly intend to continue with that work. What was I saying? Sorry. Forgive me. I'll come back on that.
The other thing I was going to say as well, kind of touching on Anne's point, sorry, I'm not sponsoring on this, was that, sorry, because I was just thinking about that also. When we were talking about schools on the slide, when we were talking about the correlation between permanent exclusions and suspensions and kind of what that looks like, but when we were talking about the improvements potentially of some of the rates in the schools as well. I'm also wondering, within kind of, because I know that you spoke about the audit that was done around like primary phase as well, like are we taking a closer look at the curriculum and what that looks like? So where a school is and maybe potentially has better rate exclusion, are we also taking a look at what that curriculum may look like in person?
I think it would be fair to say that, BET, our school improvement partner, leads on curriculum, but I think it would be fair to say that we need to use this information to feed into the work that they're undertaking with schools, and specifically with targeted schools. I remember what I was going to say now, so apologies. And one of the things that we see when we look across our city is that our school leadership is not reflective of our diverse pupil population. So there is more that we need to do as a city to encourage a greater diversity at school leadership level, both in terms of senior leadership teams of schools and at head teacher level. So I guess that doesn't explain the improvement, but that's certainly something that we need to take forward as a city.
Thank you. Just one more minute when we move on. It's just about we spoke about kind of again we talked about primary phase as well, but just not to forget about the younger children, 0 to 5 particularly, because I know within the DFE the way the collection of the data is collected, sometimes there isn't maybe robust looking at area as much, but we do have a big issue with young people being excluded. So again, hopefully that's included within the deep dive and take a good look at that.
To carry on with the presentation.
Thank you. And a lot of the conversation we've just had does link into the slide, so I'll try not to dwell on it too long. What it is worth saying is at the secondary level, the secondary local sharing panels are very effective. They're a key tool in both helping minimise the need for permanent exclusions, but also key in reintegrating children through the Fair Access Protocol, but including those who are being reintegrated from COS. And managed moves are a key part of that. And in terms of understanding some of the differentials between the primary and secondary estate, we might have an opportunity there to look at that collaborative approach and see what of that could be transferred into the primary phase. And it's worth just reinforcing the approach that's, if you like, sanctioned by government and DFE policy. We are currently being asked to comment on revised behaviour in schools guidance and also suspension and permanent exclusions guidance. So there's a consultation currently underway, and it is made clear in that policy that although for the vast majority of pupils, suspensions and PXs will not be necessary, that school exclusions and managed moves and other matters are legitimate tools of schools' behaviour policies. Thanks.
If they're applied correctly and parents are informed that those discussions are being held, and how do we ensure that that happens?
Shall I respond? I was just checking if you'd like me to respond now. But in terms of permanent exclusions, we've got very robust arrangements in place. So there are legal requirements. Schools are required to follow those requirements, and any single permanent exclusion within the city has to be reported through to the exclusions team. That is an absolute requirement. And the exclusions team will be involved in 95% of cases, actually involved at hearings and related meetings to ensure that the process, both at the point of exclusion and subsequent to exclusion, is followed correctly.
Does the same apply to managed moves?
So there are again legal requirements around managed moves. Managed moves should always be with the agreement of the three main parties, so the two schools receiving, exporting, for want of a better term, but also the family. So parents, carers got absolute right to agree to or not a managed move. And there are requirements around those managed moves and how they should be followed. When we're involved in that agenda related to permanent exclusions, then again the exclusions team are usually quite close to those particular managed moves.
Yes, I have another question around that, and it's to do with the young children with some support plans who are having behavioural policies used against them, and potentially schools using home school agreements that the children sign that enable the school to use behavioural policies even if they are sent to children. Is that appropriate, legal, allowed? We can take it offline if you wish, because I have examples.
Yeah, happy to have a more detailed conversation online, and I think to involve colleagues from the SEND world in that as well would be helpful.
Are they different from part-time timetable arrangements, or is that a part-time timetable?
So full-time timetable. We need to look into that.
So in terms of moving on, I'm very much hoping, I see the PM on the screen. Pauline, are you with us? In terms of slides 19 to 20.
Yes, absolutely. I actually have never left, actually. Yes, so what we do, we have two parts of I know that this committee has been very much focused on SENAR, but actually we have a range of teaching support services who are very much involved, along with the psychology service, in terms of supporting and where children either have been excluded or maybe even suspended. What we actually have is those services like the communication autism service. I'm going to go on to, let's do the EHCP first, which is there in the first slide, and then actually look at the broader one. If a child actually has a plan and is permanently excluded, then Alan's team notify SENAR, and SENAR will immediately refer it to the home bridging team. So that means within the 6 days that young person will actually have access to home education, and there'll be contact immediately with the family. Obviously, if the governors uphold the exclusion, then SENAR will look to see if the placement itself, and that's the statutory responsibility, needs to be reviewed in terms of, it might be the placement in terms of the school, but it might be actually the type of school. So they will actually make that decision, which will is likely in those circumstances, not always, but likely to lead to an amended plan. And obviously the teaching support and educational psychology services feed into this. Why do they? Because it's the teaching support services that are working with mainstream schools and the psychology service. And while we would know straight away in terms of if it's a special school involved, where it's mainstream, then it would be those services that would be particularly involved in advising SENAR. But we also look at preventing permanent exclusions. So the work in terms of those services, every term there is a multi-agency meeting with SENCOs, sometimes heads attend as well, and that's to discuss, amongst other things, children at risk of particularly permanent exclusion. And then we look at, within that, signposting varies within the teaching services. It might be behaviour programmes with a psychology service, whatever, in the hope that those exclusions don't take place. But in some cases, what it might mean is that if a child has a SEND provision plan, we need to readdress that SEND provision plan. It might mean that a child who is not on a SEND provision plan needs a SEND provision plan. And SEND provision plan is, it's not a statutory. It means, as Victor said earlier, above the level that the school is funded for, they need a bit more, and they need a bit more help. That's not through the statutory HCP process. It's like a halfway house. So they might need that. But as I say, EHCP, they might need an amended plan. We actually, as part of our developing local provision process, the DLP, have introduced a special schools outreach service, which is incredibly popular, where the special schools outreach service, they do have contracts with mainstream schools. Now, this is just starting, so it's not well developed at this point, but they are now in some schools, and some of those will be in relation to children's behaviour, but it isn't necessarily in that. It will be the behaviour, but it may be the child has autism, or it may be that the child has cognitive, speech and language issues. Whatever the issues are, the schools, the special schools, will moderate the bids, as we call them. So they're putting the expert staff into the mainstream schools, and that will also work as part of that programme to reduce the likelihood of exclusion. And then, and Alan can talk about this indeed, also under the DLP, ideas, because that is actually getting schools to network more. In that sense, there is a fair access team, which I think works to you, Alan, in terms of supporting, but this is secondary schools particularly, in terms of supporting those young people who are at risk of permanent exclusion. So there are we use those services who are SEND related in that context to either address exclusions or prevent exclusions.
Sounds like a great overview of what's going on. Can we move on to some questions from anybody? Counselling, Yip?
Start with time, Chair.
Do you have any questions? No? Well, I think that draws the. Do you have any more questions? No. That draws that item to an end. And thank you very much, Lisa and Alan, for coming in today, Pauline and Victor Roman for attending. I can't see who else is on the screen over there. My eyesight isn't that great, but thank you for coming in to cover that. We could move on to item 8, the work programme. We're going to add on, was it Senar and split the Senar for the next meeting and then have the one after that. Do we all agree? Agreed. Okay. Move on to date and time for the next meeting is Wednesday, 30th of March. And item 10, request for Pauline.
I'll put it down as 30th of March, Chair.
Say that again, sorry?
Next meeting, 30th of March.
Did I not say 30th of March?
Sorry, my bad.
Yeah, questioning myself then. Item 11, any other urgent business? Item 12, authority to act for transfer over from previous meeting.
It should be agreed now.
It's to an end. Sorry we're all late, everybody. Thank you very much for coming.
Thank you, Jenny.